So, thank you all very much for coming again. I'm not going to go back over the introduction that I gave last time because I think you were all here, but anyway, just in case you weren't, this is Khaled El-Rouayheb, who's Professor of Islamic Intellectual History at Harvard, and he used to be here, and sadly he's not any longer, and tonight he'll be talking about the rise of deep reading in Ottoman scholarly culture.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. I'll repeat the thanks to my thanks to the Leverhulme Trust for making it possible for me to spend a year here in Cambridge, in Old Cambridge, and to CRASSH for kindly hosting me. So, pre-modern Islamic education has often been characterized as personal rather than institutional, and as oral rather than textual. A student would ideally seek out a respected teacher, become part of his entourage, attend his classes, and hear knowledge from him. It is from cultivating this personal oral relationship with one or more teachers that a student would hope eventually to get recognition as a scholar in his own right, and be sought out by a new generation of seekers of knowledge, in effect becoming a link in a chain of transmitters of knowledge extending back to early Islamic times. In this pedagogic model, listening, discussing, repeating, memorizing, and reciting were of paramount importance. The private reading of texts, by contrast, played a subordinate and auxiliary role and was sometimes even the source of anxiety and censure. Now, this model is, of course, an ideal type, and the actual process of acquiring knowledge would only have approximated it. Nevertheless, as a depiction of a widely held cultural ideal, the model does arguably reflect the character of education in many parts of the medieval Islamic world. A number of modern studies by Berkey, Chamberlain, Efrat have emphasized the highly personal and non-institutional character of the educational process in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo from the 11th to the 15th centuries. It was from teachers and not from any institution that a student obtained recognition, as well as a certificate, an ijaza, to teach. Contemporary biographers almost always felt it important to indicate with whom a scholar had studied, and almost never in which institutions he had done so. The madrasa functioned as a college that often provided accommodation and food for students and kept one or more teachers on its payroll, but it did not issue degrees, nor was it a necessary part of the educational process, for some teachers conducted classes in mosques or Sufi lodges or at home. The transmission of knowledge and authority from teacher to student was basically face-to-face, with private reading and study playing an unofficial and complementary role. This model also seems applicable to the remnants of traditional Islamic education studied by anthropologists in the 20th century. For example, Brinkley Messick has distinguished between various ways in which 20th century Yemeni students at traditional madrasas interact with texts. Memorization, hifz, recitation, qira'ah, listening, sama', and private reading, mutala'. He noted, however, that mutala', the last here on the list, was commonly used to describe interaction with books on topics not formally studied at the madrasa, such as history and poetry. The other three modes of textual interaction, by comparison, were central to the pedagogic process, or at least to the ideal typical representation of that process. Now, in what follows, I will present evidence for the emergence of a more impersonal and textual model for the transmission of knowledge in the central Ottoman lands in the 17th and 18th centuries. It is not just that the time-honored oral ideal did not fully correspond to actual reality. It probably did not correspond to actual reality at any point, at least not perfectly. But the ideal itself appears to have been supplemented with a newly articulated ideal of the acquisition of knowledge through deep reading. This development may, I would suggest, have been related to two factors: the increased importance of the instrumental and rational sciences, and the far-reaching reforms that the Ottoman learned hierarchy underwent in the 16th century. So let's turn to this evidence. On January 4, 1691, a prominent Ottoman scholar residing in Mecca completed a treatise in Arabic on a topic that, as far as he knew, had never before received extended attention: the proper manner of perusing books, adab al-mutala'a. The scholar's name was Ahmed ibn Lutfullah Mevlevi, now better known as Munajjim Bashi. In the introduction to this work, Munajjim Bashi wrote that he had hesitated before venturing to write on a topic that no one had treated before. When he decided to write nonetheless, he entitled the treatise "The Inspiration of the Sanctuary," Fayd al-Haram. Without the guidance of previous authors, reliance would have to be placed on the divine inspiration and munificence that one could hope would be forthcoming in the presence of the sanctuary in Mecca. Munajjim Bashi's remark about the absence of any previous extended treatment of the art of perusing books appears to be true. Since the 9th century, there had been a tradition of Arabic works partly or entirely devoted to the proper ways of acquiring knowledge. But these works had said very little about studying and perusing books on one's own. Their focus was invariably on the proprieties of student-teacher interaction and the proper demeanor and conduct expected of student and teacher inside and outside of class. This can be seen in two typical and influential educational treatises from earlier centuries. Just a little visual input here. This is an extant manuscript of this work, which has not been edited. Two works from earlier centuries: Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, Turuq al-Ta'allum by Burhan ad-Din al-Zarnuji from Central Asia. We have the year in which he wrote the work, but we have little other biographical information. And Tazkirat al-Sami' wal-Mutakallim fi Adab al-Alim wal-Muta'allim by the Syrian scholar Badruddin ibn Jama'a. A brief overview of the second of these works will be helpful for bringing out the novel emphasis of Munajjim Bashi's treatment. The view that the imparting of knowledge is primarily an oral affair is revealed already in the title, which translates as the memento to the listener and speaker of the manner of the scholar and the student. The work is divided into 5 chapters. The first adduces a number of quotations from the Quran and traditions from the Prophet in praise of knowledge. The second presents the manners proper to the scholar. He should be pious and God-fearing and not use his knowledge for the sake of worldly gains. He should be clean and ritually pure when he comes to class. Start by reciting some verses from the Quran and invoke blessings on the students and all Muslims. He should lecture clearly and pause to allow questions. He should not be afraid to admit it when he does not know an answer to a question. He should behave in a kind and fatherly manner to his students and avoid undue favoritism. He may occasionally test his students' grasp or apprehension by posing questions relating to the material covered. The third chapter deals with the manners proper to the student. He should seek knowledge with the proper motives and live a diligent and pious life centered on his studies. He should eat and sleep moderately. He should seek out a pious and reputable teacher and show him respect and veneration at all times. For instance, he should be clean and neatly dressed before entering the presence of the teacher, should avoid addressing the teacher in the second person, and be courteous in his manner of posing questions. He should keep his eyes focused on the teacher during class, sit still and upright, and avoid fiddling with his hands, stroking his beard, picking his nose, leaning against a pillar or wall, or presenting his back to the teacher. The student should begin his studies by memorizing the Quran and learning its meanings. Then move on to the study of hadith, the reports about the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad. Then creedal theology, aqa'id, jurisprudence, fiqh, and grammar. In each field, he should memorize a short introductory manual and then attend the classes of a reputed teacher to hear the manuals explained and commented upon. Before memorizing, however, he should make sure his copy of a manual is correct. He should therefore read out his own manuscript copy in the presence of the teacher or the teacher's assistant and incorporate corrections. He should behave to his fellow students in a mild and brotherly fashion and should not get into acrimonious debates with them or bicker over seating order. Apparently a huge problem. After class, the students should discuss among themselves the points that have been covered. Should the student find no one to discuss with, he should discuss with himself, repeating both the meaning and the wording of what he has heard, مَا سَمِعَهُ, so that both are taken to heart. The fourth chapter concerns a student's proper behavior with books. He should treat books with respect, for example, not placing them on the floor, nor using them to fan himself, or to squash bedbugs. When copying a book, he should be in a state of ritual purity and face in the direction of the Kaaba. His copy should start with a standard pious formulae, and every time the copied text mentions God, prophets, or respected predecessors, standard expressions of respect should be added in full, even if these are not to be found in the text of the exemplar. He should collate his copy carefully and introduce needed corrections and disambiguations in the text or in the margin. The fifth and final chapter concerns the behavior proper to those residing in a college, madrasa. For example, they should not be idle or engage in frivolous chatter. Noise levels should be kept to a minimum, as should unnecessary visits to and from the outside world. As is clear from the preceding overview, the role of private reading is marginal in Ibn Jama'ah's presentation. There are around a dozen passing references to mutala'ah in the work, to private perusal of books. But most of these place the activity outside the context of a student's acquisition of knowledge. Only a handful of occurrences of mutala'ah related specifically to the process of a student's acquisition of knowledge. For example, we are told that nights are especially suitable for peer discussion, mudhakara, and mutala'ah. And that after having memorized and mastered the introductory manuals, a student should move on to longer and more advanced works and regularly engage in mutala'ah. But we are told these things by the way. So Ibn Jama'ah was well aware that students do engage in private reading, mutala'ah. Nevertheless, he gave only passing attention to the activity, highlighting instead the teacher-student relationship in the process of the acquisition of knowledge. He stressed that the student should seek out recognized and pious scholars who themselves had studied with recognized and pious scholars. He should avoid those teachers who, quote, take knowledge from the insides of folios, end quote. Man akhadha min butun al-awraq. Knowledge should not, he wrote, be taken from books, for this is one of the most harmful of vices. Following a tradition that was already centuries old in his time, Ibn Jama'ah presented the transmission and acquisition of knowledge as taking place primarily in the presence of a teacher, and as being brought about by the activities of listening, reciting, memorizing, posing questions, and grasping answers and orally delivered answers and explanations. Now, the works of Zarnuji and Ibn Jama'ah were paradigmatic for a number of later treatments of education. For example, the discussions of the topic by the 16th century Damascene scholar Badruddin al-Ghazi, or the 16th century Syrian Shiite scholar Zainuddin al-Amili, or the 16th century Ottoman scholar and judge Ahmed Tashköprüzade are clearly in the same tradition. There are some differences between these later authors that might be worth pursuing in a different context, but they all shared with Zarnuji and Ibn Jama'ah the emphasis on teacher-student interaction, at the expense of activities such as private reading. Now, it is precisely the shift in emphasis towards private reading that is so conspicuous in Munajjim Bashi's work. Now, Munajjim Bashi was not the first to write on Adab al-Mutala'. As he acknowledged in his introduction, he was familiar with one previous book on the topic, written by, quote, one of the later scholars, end quote. It was, he wrote, very short. He describes it as a single folio sheet, and consisted mainly of advice derived from the discipline of Adab al-Bahth, which I spoke about last week, dialectics, the theory of argumentation. The work in question can be identified with some confidence as the treatise on Adab al-Mutala'a by a certain Hamid ibn Burhan ad-Din al-Ghaffari that survives in numerous extant manuscripts. Unfortunately, no obituaries or biographical notices of this scholar have been found yet. There is some manuscript evidence that would place him in Shiraz in the 1490s. The attributes of Ghaffari suggest that he belonged to the Persian Ghaffari family that has produced a number of distinguished figures, historians, painters, governors, and statesmen since the 16th century. Ghaffari's work is very much as Munajjim Bashi described it. It is very short, around 2 folio leaves of text, and is in the main an application of the principles of dialectics to the art of reading. Ghaffari wrote that a statement in a text is either a definition of some sort or a straightforward claim, propositional claim. In the former case, the reader must consider whether the formal requirements of definitions are met. Is the definition adequate? Is it circular? Does it use terms that are more familiar than the definiendum? Does it use figurative or unclear terms? In the later case, in the case of a straightforward claim, the reader must consider whether the premises are themselves justifiable, or whether they actually imply the conclusion, or whether the argument is defective in a general way. For example, if it is circular or leads to implausible conclusions when applied in other cases. Or whether it is possible to construct a counter-argument for the opposing conclusion. Now, I hope those of you who were here last week will recognize these dialectical strategies from typical manuals on Adab al-Bahth. The reader is enjoined to read a certain issue in the text from beginning to end in such a way that the overall meaning is grasped. Then he ought to proceed as just mentioned, considering whether any dialectical objection can be raised, and what, if any, answer can be given to such objections. Ghaffari urged the reader to attempt to read texts in this way again and again. For by sustained effort and practice, it is possible to, quote, ascend in reading in such a manner as to be able to distinguish between what is to be accepted and what is to be rejected, end quote. Now, Ghaffari's treatise shows that the first written reflections on Adab al-Mutala', on the proper rules of reading, were deeply influenced by the discipline of Adab al-Bahth. It also shows the intimate link between the novel scholarly field of Adab al-Mutala' and the ideal of tahqiq, verification, that I also discussed in my lecture last week. Ghaffari explicitly wrote in his introduction that he had composed the work as an aid to, quote, all those who seek to ascend in degrees of exactitude and who prepare to embark on the roads of verification. To be a verifier, a muhaqqiq, meant to be able to read closely, discern the structure of the argument in the text, and anticipate dialectical objections and replies. Now, Munajjim Bashi might have derived the idea of writing on Adab al-Mutala'a from Ghaffari's treatise, but he derived little else. His own contribution is significantly, more than 10 times longer, and deals with a range of issues and problems not broached in his predecessor's very brief work. It was with some justification that he claimed to be treading new ground, and having to rely on inspiration rather than following in the footsteps of earlier authors. After the above-mentioned preamble, in which he expressed his hesitation about writing the treatise at all, Munajjim Bashi introduced his work with a proposed working definition of mutala'. Lexically, the verbal noun means examination or perusal. In its technical sense, it refers specifically to the examination of texts, or, as he proposed, perceiving writing so as to obtain an understood meaning. That's his definition, that's at least his first definition. He goes on a little bit later to give a slightly longer one. Perceiving written utterances whose conventional meaning is familiar, to arrive thereby at the intention behind their use. Now, it's important to note that the ability to engage in mutala'a, this thus defined, is not, he wrote, present in the beginner. The ability to derive istikhraj, meanings and authorial intentions from the written text is dependent on, quote, learning the principles of the instrumental sciences and being able to call their most important parts to mind, end quote. In other words, the inability to engage in perusal, mutala'a, is not due to sheer illiterate incomprehension of written signs. It is rather because, without a grounding in a range of instrumental disciplines, syntax, logic, dialectic, semantics, rhetoric, a beginning student would not go beyond a reading that Munajjim Bashi characterized as superficial, sathi, or crudely literal, zahiri, or uncritical, hashwi. Now the terms zahiri and hashwi were often used by Muslim scholars who were open to logic and the rational sciences to disparage more literalist and fideist currents associated with the defunct Zahiri school of law and the minority Hanbali school of law. However, the terms hashwi and Zahiri were often used in a broader and less determinate sense, and Munajjim Bashi need not have had any particular religious groupings in mind. The example he gives is qassas, popular storytellers. He may simply have thought that a reader equipped with nothing more than literacy in classical Arabic was unlikely to make much headway with the highly technical handbooks on theology, jurisprudence, and Quran exegesis that would have been studied by more advanced Ottoman students. After having gained a familiarity with the basics of the instrumental and rational sciences, a student develops the ability to engage in derivation of meaning, what he calls malakat al-istikhraj, from written scholarly handbooks. And this is clearly what mutala'a implies. So it's not simply reading. The intermediate and advanced student who engages in this manner with a scholarly text is seeking one of four things, according to Munajjim Bashi. Obviously, to obtain knowledge that he does not have, to move beyond knowledge taken on trust, taqlid, and uncover the evidential basis of scholarly propositions, or to deepen his evidentiary knowledge by repeated perusal, thus obtaining a thorough familiarity with the evidence and, quote, the ability to call to mind at will, which he calls malakat al-istihdar, or to deepen the evidentiary and consolidated knowledge by strengthening it through refreshing his acquaintance with familiar texts or through exposure to new texts and alternative presentations and proofs. I don't have time, so basically he devotes a chapter to each of these aims. For reasons of time, I will only discuss the first chapter, in which he presents the proprieties that are relevant to all four categories of readers. Before commencing, a reader should mention the name of God and invoke blessings on his prophet, followed by some choice prayers asking for divine inspiration and guidance. If he is reading a handbook on a scholarly discipline, he should have some initial conception of this discipline, its definition, its subject matter, and its aims. The reader may also be consulting the discussion of a particular issue, a certain mabhath in a work, in which case he should have a clear initial conception of this issue. On encountering a passage, he should start by paying attention to its language, lexically, morphologically, syntactically, semantically, and rhetorically. He should then turn to the level of second intentions, al-ma'qulat al-thaniya, i.e. second-order concepts, which are the province of logic. He should pay attention to what kinds of definitions are being adduced, what kinds of propositions, and the logical structure of any arguments. In general, Munajjim Bashi noted, a student would find the disciplines of logic and syntax to be especially helpful in his efforts to understand demanding scholarly texts. This is what he wrote. The truth is that these two disciplines, logic and grammar, are like the parents of the student with regard to his education. So every student should strive to obtain a thorough ability in these two fields by heeding them in all his perusals. It's telling that Munajjim Bashi should compare two disciplines to a student's parents. In the older educational literature, it was typically the teacher who was cast in a paternal role. And incidentally, note also that the old antagonism between grammarians and logicians, which has received a great deal of scholarly attention dating back to the 9th, 10th century, by the Ottoman time had completely disappeared. Anyway, Mutala'a for Munajjim Bashi was obviously more than just reading. It is rather a close examination of a scholarly text that starts with paying attention to its syntactic, semantic, rhetorical, and logical features. Having done this, the reader should sum up the relevant issue by conceiving in his mind the claim, the argument, and the principles on which the argument rests. A sign that he has achieved this, according to Munajjim Bashi, is that he is able to express the issue briefly and in his own words. أن يقتدر على التعبير عنه بأي عبارة شاء وبأوجز العبارات. The differences between the works of Munajjim Bashi and that of Ibn Jama'a are conspicuous. In Munajjim Bashi's treatise, Mutala'a is at the center of attention. The student-teacher relationship is acknowledged in passing as important, but otherwise plays a subordinate role in a discussion of the proper means of extracting meanings from texts. In the work of Ibn Jama'a, it is precisely the other way around. The existence of Mutala'a is acknowledged in passing, but the author's focus is on the teacher-student relation and the oral transmission of knowledge. Also noteworthy in Munajjim Bashi's work is the emphasis on logic, dialectic, semantics, and rhetoric, as well as the prominent and positive references to philosophy, hikmah. These disciplines are not mentioned in the work of Ibn Jama'a, who clearly assumed that a student's studies would focus on the core religious disciplines, Quran recitation and exegesis, hadith and law, supplemented with Arabic grammar. Now, the emphasis on the student-text relationship and on the rational and instrumental sciences do not seem to be an effect of mere idiosyncrasy on the part of Munajjim Bashi. Both emphases are also to be found in an educational work entitled Tartib al-Ulum, the ordering of the sciences, by Munajjim Bashi's younger Ottoman contemporary Mehmet Sajakli-Zade, who I mentioned briefly last week. Like Munajjim Bashi, Sajakli-Zade considered a working knowledge of the instrumental and rational sciences to be a necessary condition for engaging in Mutala'a. This is what he wrote. The student is not prepared for Mutala'a after just gaining knowledge of lexicography, morphology, and syntax. Only after also gaining knowledge of logic, dialectic, rational theology, kalam, semantics, and the principles of jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh. And then he specifies, I do not mean by rational theology the creedal issues alone, the aqa'id, but rather the discussions of substances and attributes as included in works such as Al-Maqasid and Al-Mawaqif. These are late Kalam works where approximately 2/3 of the volume of the works are engaged or devoted to metaphysical and natural philosophical preliminaries. Only sort of the last third are really traditional Kalam works discussing the traditional Kalam issues. So again, all of this is a prerequisite for being able to engage properly in Mutala'a. Sajakli-Zade recommended that the student, after learning Arabic, of course he's writing in Turkish-speaking Anatolia, the Quran and the basics of the faith, should study the sciences in the following order: morphology, syntax, basic law, al-ahkam, logic, dialectic, rational theology, kalam, semantics, ilm al-ma'ani, rhetoric, ilm al-bayan, jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh. Again, he specified that by rational theology he did not mean basic creedal works, but the aforementioned sumai of philosophical theology with their extensive epistemological and metaphysical preliminaries. Only then should the student venture to study hadith and Quran exegesis. This order tallies well with what we know of the curriculum of Ottoman education, in which instrumental and rational sciences were typically studied at basic and intermediate levels, whereas jurisprudence, hadith, and Quran exegesis would be reserved for the most advanced levels. But it is very different from the order envisaged by Zarnuji and Ibn Jama'ah, who, like the Venerable Al-Ghazali from the 11th century, assumed that the student would focus on the core religious disciplines and study these in the order of their importance. It is particularly striking that in Ghazali's Ihya Ulum ad-Din, which is cited on a number of occasions in Sarjaqli Zadi's work, the student is advised to begin by studying the Quran, then Hadith, then the Quranic sciences, then the Hadith sciences, then positive law, then jurisprudence, and only then other sciences. Ghazali elsewhere explicitly rejected the suggestion that one should study Kalam before studying jurisprudence. The increased importance of the rational and instrumental sciences in Ottoman education was part of a more general trend in the Islamic world. After the 12th century, and helped by the endorsement of prominent religious scholars such as Al-Ghazali and Fakhruddin al-Razi, logic started to feature regularly in the education of Muslim students. The trend was reinforced by the immensely influential 14th century Timurid scholars Taftazani and Jurjani, whose works in a number of fields, including logic, were standard fare in Ottoman education. It is not only that logic was widely studied by Ottoman students, familiarity with the discipline was assumed by later authors writing on other fields. Jurists, theologians, and grammarians increasingly made conscious use of Greek logical concepts and argument forms in their writings. The science of semantics rhetoric, Ilm al-Ma'ani wal-Bayan, in which the writings of Taftazani and Jurjani played a central role, also became increasingly important in later centuries. Ghazali, Zarnuji, and Ibn Jama'ah had not felt the need to mention this discipline at all. But for a scholar like Sarjaqli Zadi, it was a precondition for the mastery of jurisprudence and Quran exegesis. The most widely studied Quran commentaries in Ottoman scholarly circles were those by Az-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi, and both works, as well as their standard glosses by later scholars, are indeed practically incomprehensible to a reader who has had no exposure to semantics rhetoric. I've tried to give my students passages from these two. It never works. I can give them Tabari, no problem, Ibn Kathir, no problem, but these people, they require so much background knowledge of the fields of semantics and rhetoric that it's extremely difficult to assign my students texts from these. But nevertheless, there's general agreement. These were the most popular tafsir studied in an Ottoman context. The other basic point on which Munajjim Bashi differed conspicuously from previous authors was his focus on the student-text relationship as opposed to the student-teacher relation. Sarjaqli Zadi's work betrays the same novel emphasis. He regularly exhorted the student to study particular works, to avoid others, and to read works in a particular order. At one point, he recommended his own handbook on Quran recitation, Tajweed, together with his own commentary, writing, "He who has perused at-Tala'a," is derived from the same root as Mutala'a, "these two works will not be in need of most other works on this topic and will become a recognized authority in this discipline." Now this seems to be a quite straightforward exhortation to take knowledge from books, the very thing that Ibn Jama'ah was warning against. Sarjaqli Zadi repeatedly singled out particular works as especially useful and advised the budding scholar to have a copy of them. Now, to be sure, it may well have been Sarjaqli Zadi's assumption that the student, particularly in his younger years, would study such works with a teacher. My point is not that Sarjaqli Zadi or Munajjim Bashi thought good teachers to be unimportant or dispensable. Nevertheless, the emphasis of Sarjaqli Zadi's work is conspicuously on the student choosing the right texts, not choosing the right teacher. Like Ibn Jama'ah, Sarjaqli Zadi counseled the student to collate his manuscript copy. But he did so in passing. Ibn Jama'ah spends quite a lot of time on this. Sarjaqli Zadi mentions it in passing, noting that the reader might waste time trying to make sense of a corrupt text unless care was taken to make sure that the manuscript copy was free from scribal misreadings and omissions. This, however, was clearly a preliminary step for Sarjaqli Zadi before the student moved on to other, more advanced tasks. He wrote, then the student can proceed with deep reading, al-mutala'a al-amiqa, and exploring subtle aspects and raising questions and suggesting answers. Okay, it's time for me to maybe draw some threads together. Two Ottoman works on education by Munajim Bashi and Sajakli-Zadeh, written independently of each other between 1691 and 1716, are markedly different from the classical Arabic-Islamic pedagogic literature. They both evince a distinct shift of emphasis away from the student-teacher relationship and the oral model for the transmission of knowledge, and focus instead on the proper reading of texts. This novel focus may conceivably have been related to the increased importance of the rational sciences. The oral model of the transmission of knowledge was developed in early Islamic times, when knowledge, ilm, paradigmatically consisted of reports about the sayings and doings of the Prophet or other venerable figures, or reports about Quranic readings, or reports about Quran exegesis. Reports whose acceptability was largely a function of the personal reputation of their transmitters. It is perhaps not surprising that the hold of this model weakened in later centuries, when the greater part of students' education was spent poring over dense scholastic handbooks on syntax, semantics, rhetoric, logic, dialectic, rational theology, and jurisprudence. The oral ideal depicted by classical educational manuals had, by the 17th century, simply ceased to do justice to the role of careful reading in the acquisition of knowledge. The shift in focus may also be related to the peculiar situation, peculiar at least from an Islamicate perspective, of Ottoman students after the 16th century. Starting with a series of measures instituted by the famed Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam, Abu Saud, who dies in 1574, the character of Ottoman education was transformed in significant ways. One aspect of these reforms that is particularly relevant, I think, to the present issue, is that access to higher teaching or judiciary posts came to depend upon the obtaining of a formal certificate, a mulazimat. And significantly, only relatively few scholars occupying the higher echelons of the judicial and educational apparatus were entitled to grant these mulazimats. And only at specific times. It is generally recognized in modern scholarship that this led to a bottleneck situation in which the number of certificates granted was relatively small in relation to the number of students seeking them. This novel feature of Ottoman education must have meant that for many students, the person who taught them and the person who granted them a formal certificate were no longer the same. Previously, throughout Islamic history, they were typically the same. The most coveted mulazimats were those granted by the highest ranking authorities in the learned hierarchy, the Shaykh al-Islam himself, or the military judges of Rumelia and Anatolia. Learned scholars, to be sure, but usually no longer directly involved in teaching. Ambitious Ottoman students would usually seek to become part of the entourage of such high-ranking dignitaries, serving as clerks or scribes or teaching assistants. Obtaining such connections certainly involved a great deal of networking, ingratiation, and sometimes bribery. But it is unlikely that assessments of academic abilities were irrelevant in this sharpened competition for certificates. In fact, it was not unknown in the 17th century for the grantor of a mulazimat to ask an applicant to take an examination, imtihan. There is scattered evidence for such examinations throughout the 17th century. For example, we have evidence that in 1658 there was a scholar in Istanbul who held the official position of examiner of the ulama, mumayyizi ulama. After an imperial edict of 1703, such examinations to obtain a mulazimat became the rule. One such examination in 1754, for which we have vivid evidence in the form of an extant diary by one of the examinees, was administered at the office of the Shaykh al-Islam, and only 26 of 99 applicants passed. Now, these reforms meant that an ambitious student's academic abilities would, at crucial stages, be evaluated by a scholar who was not his own teacher, sometimes even by means of the modern and impersonal institution of the centrally administered examination. In such a situation, the older literature that set forth the proprieties of student-teacher relationships may have appeared less timely and relevant, particularly for more advanced Ottoman students, than works that focused on how to peruse demanding works and gave advice on what texts to study and in what order. It is widely assumed that the quote-unquote Islamic model for the transmission of knowledge remained largely personal, informal, and oral until the modern period. And it has even been suggested by Toby Huff in his The Rise of Early Modern Science that this non-institutional, personal character of education might have been one of the reasons for the quote-unquote failure of Islamic civilization to develop modern science and modern scientific institutions. But the fact of the matter is that, after the 16th century at least, a more formal and text-centered model for the transmission of knowledge emerged in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire, resulting in centralized examinations and certification, as well as a marked shift in educational manuals from the proprieties of teacher-student interaction to strategies for deep reading. Thank you. And just in case I couldn't resist putting this up, this is what deep reading looks like.
Yeah.
This is actually, I mentioned last week the work on dialectics by Hussein Adanavi, which I argued was quite novel compared to, and this is a copy. And the scribe/scholar has, of course, added all of these marginal and sometimes interlinear annotations to the work.